Hello and welcome to the Room of Lives. This is your host, Neil. In this part of my conversation with Pace Davis, he talks about being the first human diagnosed with a kind of congenital myopathy, a neuromuscular disease that had previously only been studied in other animals. He describes its causes and effects and how it shaped his life to be brought up without any accommodations for the disease. If you enjoy listening to this conversation, consider supporting me by donating dye or ether to abranil.eth. That's abhranil.eth. So, for our final two topics, we wanted to talk about. So, this is new. I hadn't heard about this before. Is the health and wellness aspect. So, tell me a little bit more about this diagnosis that you got when you were
9.
29.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a congenital myopathy is an inherited myopathy, and they can be inherited in a variety of ways. Like you could be the first generation to have the mutation, but then you would pass it on after, or you could get it from like X-linked, which is like mothers pass on through the X chromosome. There are a lot of different kinds of myopathies, and I have one that happens with a variation of the SRPK3 gene, which is a protein kinase gene. I was diagnosed loosely as a child, kind of re-diagnosed as an adult, but not finally. And I finally found a specialist who was like kind of very current on research or whatever in Austin. And so I got this diagnosis. And so what it means is to get, not trying to get too complicated. They had studied mice and pigs, who didn't have this gene, or had it called like SRPK3 null mice, had like a muscular deficits and cardiovascular deficits. Pigs as well, and so that's what I was born with, and I'm the first person. So the literature didn't actually say like you have the SRPK3 myopathy. It was saying this is the only gene variation we found when we did a total, what's it called, like a gene sequencing of you, is that I submitted my DNA to have gene sequencing done or whatever, done a gene examination. And that's the only thing that flagged, was that we have studies showing this in mice and pigs. So this is really the only thing we can find that would make sense. And so then I became the first person found with this gene variation, the first human found with this gene variation. Doesn't mean the first one never exists, but the first person found. And the way that takes effect is that, so cardiovascularly, I actually...
So prior to you, any literature surrounding this mutation was in non-human, like in other animals?
It's only mice and pigs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this, as its own specific disease, did not exist for humans?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so the way it works is generally there's a couple of things. One, in muscle fibers, the nuclei live on the edge of the fiber. Like they live on the edge of the cell, right? And then they go to the middle to repair, and then they go back to the edge of the fiber, and they stay there. If you look at like a diagram of my muscle fibers from a biopsy under a microscope, they find that the nuclei often live in the center. The structure of muscle fibers is usually hexagonal, so it looks like a beehive, right? So it's like this beehive chain link of fibers. And then you'll find in a lot of my fibers that the shape of the cell is actually somewhat ovular or circular, and they're kind of blobbed against each other instead of like really perfectly positioned next to each other in this beehive state. So it's a less efficient arrangement. So it's like an energy inefficient arrangement, right? And the same thing with the nuclei, but it's energy inefficient. So they have to go to the edge of the cell and they go back to the center and they stay there. And so there's like an energy inefficiency happening in speed, right? So like producing force seems to be related to this inefficiency, right? And then the third thing is that, do you know much about fiber typing, like muscular fiber typing?
No.
So there's basically three fiber types. There's like, and I feel like I'm gonna get this wrong, but I believe it's 1, 2A, and 2X. And I haven't read much about this since I got my diagnosis, so it's been about 2 years. But about this specific aspect of it. So the average person, they think there's not, and there's some research on fiber typing, but there's not a tremendous amount on like athletes and other stuff. There's a new study that just came out that's pretty interesting, but they think the average person has these basically type 1 and type 2 fibers, and depending on the muscle, like the quadricep muscle might be different than the bicep, but you have about 50-50 type 2A and type 1. Type 2A are your fast twitch. They produce force. They create like they're the ones that like would be responsible for like the sprint or the jump, right? And then type 1 is this kind of slow twitch, kind of endurance fiber. And I think traditionally people have thought of them as like, one is like going on a long run and one is going on a sprint. There's some aspect to that, but maybe the best way to think of it is just like one is this, or one of the ways that I've learned to think about it is that what we find is that in type 2A fibers, that almost all muscular growth in people comes from recruitment of type 2 fibers. So type 1 recruitment doesn't usually result in hypertrophy and growth, right? Or like neural connection change.
So the slow muscle is the one that is associated with growth?
No, the fast.
The fast one.
The fast, powerful.
Okay.
And then there's this other type, I believe it's 2X, and that is this fiber type that can actually shift. So maybe like, I don't know, 5%, something like that of your muscle fibers are slow, and they can become fast through recruitment. So if you repetitively train for fast twitch, you will actually make them more fast twitch. So anyway, that's kind of an introduction. There's actually a new study that was just published that's really interesting, where they studied elite level Olympic weightlifters. And they found incredibly high type 2 fiber dominance. But type 2 fibers didn't always predict performance, but they did find that like they found up to 85% type 2 fibers in certain athletes, and they found that type 2 fibers increased with training time and like years trained and performance peak. So like Olympic level athletes had more type 2 fibers than national level athletes. And one of the really interesting things too that draws into this idea of like, we have this idea that type 1 fibers, a small percentage can change. And this paper doesn't say, like they're not going to conclude this, but it draws into the really interesting question of, can we convert over 20 years of training or 15 years of training? Can we actually convert higher than 5% or whatever of our fiber types to type 2? So that being said, so I was diagnosed with this disease, and I'm a very rare individual in that the therapy suggested for congenital myopathies is practically nothing. Now, many of them are more severe than mine, but they don't tell you like you should exercise. They don't tell you that you should go to a PT necessarily. They basically, when I was a kid, they were just like, I don't know, just that's life. And my parents took an interesting approach, which I can't imagine many parents taking, is they decided that they wouldn't inform my school and then I would be forced to participate in all activities as if I didn't have a disease. Now, this made doing these activities very difficult, but I was like required to run every day. I was required to play sports, etc., etc. So I grew up using my body. And then when I was about 18, I picked up weightlifting. So I started lifting weights religiously, basically from the age of about 18.
So subjectively, how does it feel like to have this disease? Are you just able to not exert as much force as you see other people exerting? Or?
Yeah, so like I can't run as long typically. I can't run as fast. When I was younger, it was worse. Right? I had really bad like muscular coordination and stuff. And I've been so active that I've made up for a lot of the coordination deficits. I'm actually probably more coordinated than many people. But like as far as actual production of force, it's like almost impossible to produce the force of an average person would. So it's funny because in some ways I'm actually more adequate at doing many things than many people. But if I were to go toe to toe on just simply strength with almost any grown-up individual, it would be less, right? And the muscles are disproportionately affected. So like my calves are less affected than my proximal muscles, which would be like my upper leg, my upper arms, my neck. So those muscles are the weakest and they produce the least proportional force. So I started lifting weights, and I think one of the things I found is that being active and lifting weights increased my quality of life significantly. And so originally, so I should say that I've only had one period in my adult life where I didn't use my body like religiously, regularly, 2 to 4 times a week. And the decline in my quality of life in the 6 months I was in the West Bank, not using my body, was so significant. I became so much weaker, so much kind of more physically exhausted by certain things that it really concerned me as to like, one, what would my life with a myopathy be like if I had been raised not to use my body? Would I be like wheelchair bound, right? 2, are there people out there with myopathies that have been discouraged from attempting to use their bodies rigorously because of a fear that rigorously using their body will cause a negative reaction. And now they are, say, wheelchair bound as a result of this. Because in muscular dystrophy, if you use your muscles, it causes an actual chain reaction. You're missing dystrophin protein. And so therefore, like, a chain reaction happens when you use your muscles, and they die, right? So it's like, so there are conditions under which you actually don't want someone using their muscles because it'll speed up their death. That doesn't appear to be the case with mine. And so, so I've used my body my whole life.
This specialist in Austin that finally did the exact diagnosis, did that person have any recommendations? Or
he actually recommended I don't lift weight. He like strongly recommended against it, and he strongly recommended against any concentric like weightlifting, which is like really interesting.
What is concentric?
It's like the part where you bring it towards you or whatever. There's like eccentric and concentric, like drawing and then pushing away. And then maybe the other one he mentioned again is isometric, which is like a hold. So if you do like a plank, you know, with your abs, that'd be isometric. It'd be like a static hold. But he recommended strong against it, and I laughed in his face. And I was like, I'm 29, I'm sitting in front of you. I'm literally living proof that nothing you're saying can be true. Because if it was, I would be dead. Right? If exercise was bad for me, if it caused me to die faster, I would be dead because I've been exercising aggressively for years.
And where was he getting this from? Because my understanding is that you were the first diagnosis. So he's just kind of extrapolating from other...
So he's extrapolating from other myopathies, but it's also this really interesting question that comes up is if there's so little literature on myopathies that it makes one wonder as if simply there have been no therapies tried that involve exercise. And so there's simply the fear that as a doctor you could be harming your patient, and so to do nothing is preferable to harm, right? So like do no harm can often be interpreted as just hands off, right? Because like a patient can't blame you for dying from their myopathy if they sit in their chair all day. But if you tell them to exercise and they die faster, they could say that you did that, right? So that was kind of my impression of him. And so I undertook this idea that I had been lifting weights for several years, and or for almost a decade at that point, or I guess over a decade at that point. And I took up Olympic weightlifting, which is explosive weightlifting. It's fast, right? It's moving movements over your head really quickly. It's moving movements off the ground really quickly. And one, it improved my motor skills a lot. And I think I got a little bit stronger from it, but it was really interesting because I had this theory that that if I recruited my type 2 fibers, that's the other thing I forgot to mention. I'm disproportionately type 1. I'm like 75 to 85% type 1, as opposed to like the 50-50 of the average person walking around. And so I thought if I recruited my type 2, then maybe I could create muscular growth. If I ate a very high protein diet, and a caloric surplus, created an anabolic environment, one in which muscle can grow in the average person, right? But like maybe even better in my case, and then used fast twitch fiber recruitment, they could actually create muscle that in an environment otherwise that muscle would never naturally happen. And it's kind of still, the jury's a little out. Like I actually did get stronger. And I mean, for me, a large amount. For the average person, maybe not a significant increase. But like I think so, health and wellness became years ago and has remained this kind of interesting frontier for me because it's like directly affects my life. Although the things I practice could apply to the average person. So if I can gain muscle with them, then the argument could be that anyone can gain muscle with them. But I think also they very specifically apply to my life and recruiting muscle for my purposes.
Thank you for joining us today in the Room of Lives. In the next and final part of my conversation with Pace, we talk about the roles of the various strategies for addressing depression, such as therapy, medicine, psychedelics, and meditation.